One of the things that we often miss, I think, is that while our technologies have advanced, even just from year to year, not to mention decade or century or millennia, have advanced or evolved in ways that generations before could never have even dreamed of, we humans have not. Not really. We are more like our ancestors 2,000 years ago than we are different from them. All too often, our lives continue to be shaped by a sort of base evolutionary operating system. You might call it our OS 1.0. That just like our fight, flight, or freeze responses, our brains are also wired to categorize the world into helpful but simplistic labels. There's good and evil, pretty and ugly, smart and stupid, us and them. Missing the fact that there may be 100 degrees between two ends of any spectrum. There's, of course, a role for this kind of thinking, right? Especially in our distant past when we had to quickly assess a threat in order to find safety or be killed. Is it safe or is it unsafe, right? This internal OS 1.0 is always comparing ourselves to others and asking, am I better or worse? What's in it for me? There's perhaps a role for this when it comes to survival in the wild. But it's not particularly useful when it comes to seeking truth, when it comes to understanding and honoring others in relationship, or to the immense subtlety of actual personal experience. It won't get us very far if we're operating in that way with each other. And I think, for example, of these words from the Russian philosopher and novelist Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who said, if only there were evil people insidiously somewhere committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them out from the rest of us and destroy them. If only. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, he wrote. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? As the Reverend Anna Strickland reminds us, so much of the beauty of the world comes from the in-between places. In the space between night and day, the sun and atmosphere collide into a dazzling display of color. The edges of things, the mixing spaces, the spaces where biomes collide, are the most interesting places on earth. And yet we feel this compulsion to exist in simple, clearly defined categories. We construct boxes around sacred and secular, woman and man, left and right, in and out, compressing the complexity and beauty of the whole spectrum of being just into two words. And so this Lent, we are wading into that messy middle, the beautiful in-betweens of life in these sacred texts, to find God and to stretch our imagination, our understanding, to hear Jesus calling us to evolve beyond our simplistic binaries, our OS 1.0, towards something like an OS 2.0. We were made to operate in a different way than we evolved to. And we begin that journey with two stories this morning from our Gospel of Luke about Samaritans. So Jesus is beginning his journey from Galilee in the north toward Jerusalem, south of there, and all the events that will unfold there, which again, we narrate during Holy Week. Directly in between Galilee and Jerusalem is Samaria. Passing through Samaria is the most direct route, but it was also a dangerous one. You see, there was a long and hostile history between Jews and Samaritans. And while scholars debate the origins of that hostility, they do not debate the intensity of it. Perhaps part of the conflict is that there was enough shared history, religiously and culturally, between Jews and Samaritans that each saw the other as a sort of bastardization, as deficient, as stealing their traditions. the illegitimate ones. The intensity of this othering and dehumanization that goes along with it, it would be hard to convey if it wasn't still so common. Each of us knows this level of intensity in our own lives, in our own world, the intensity of this polarization. We feel it. It cuts right through our own hearts. Now, it's true that Jesus has to pass through Samaria, but as anyone who has driven through that part of town or place populated by those people not like us knows, our instinct is usually to spend as little time there as possible. Right? When we pause, we get out, our hearts start to race. We might find ourselves scared a little bit, even if we know we shouldn't be. We see others as a potential threats first rather than conversational partners. Again, from an evolutionary perspective, that OS 1.0, it makes sense. It's unfamiliar. And in this instance, the Samaritans, or whoever the particular people it was, that Jesus' disciples encountered as they went ahead of him, they act just as we would expect, just as Jesus' disciples expected. Jews in Samaria? No, thank you. There's no room for you here. And you can almost feel the blood boiling in James and John, again, two of Jesus' closest disciples, who in a rage petitioned Jesus to call down fire from heaven to consume them. Wipe them out. See, they're filthy, no good roaches. Let's get rid of them. I knew it. They don't respect us. They dismiss us. But Jesus turns and rebukes them. While they want to sit and stew in their ancient hatred, Jesus calls them to simply carry on to the next village. Don't engage. Let them be. Just go on. And along the way, we get a series of would-be followers who approach Jesus. They have good intentions. They want to follow Jesus, to join him in this thing that he is doing. But Jesus calls them to put their money where their mouths are. Somewhere in between good intentions and impulsive action lies actual discipleship. We are called to commit to aligning our intentions and our actions. I don't know if you had this thought, but one might, I sort of did, that Jesus' response is a bit harsh. Doesn't it sound like it? It's a bit harsh, but it's urgent. Again, remember, Jesus is headed toward Jerusalem. He's not just at any point in his life, his ministry, living his best days. He knows that time is short. There's an urgency to now. He's headed toward his rejection. At this point, he's kind of like Dr. King in the days before his assassination, right? Just as Dr. King was on the FBI's most wanted list, the government was looking for a way to get rid of him. Jesus knows that violence lies ahead of him. So he needs real commitment. He's not interested in wishy-washy, half in, half out kind of stuff. He needs action, not just intentions. And it's readily apparent that these potential disciples, they're not quite ready for the task at hand. And so as Lent begins, as we think about the world we are living in and through, we might also ask ourselves, are we ready for the task at hand? Are we ready and willing to be transformed by this journey? Are we ready to align our actions with our best intentions? See, Lent calls us to step forward even when we're not fully ready. This text invites even the noblest reason to ask for an extension. Hold up, Jesus, I'm almost ready, but first I have to do that thing that nobody wants to do. Bury my own flesh and blood. Right? It's almost unthinkable to imagine the request to abandon burying a family member. Right? That's one of those times to show up in the hard work of being human. But as Dr. Mindy McGarris-Sharp puts it in her commentary in those devotionals that are available in the back, if we zoom out to communal readiness, activating intentions to change while the fresh death of old, harmful, and yet beloved ways of life, beloved familiar structures, systems, behaviors, attitudes, while we haven't even begun to collectively grieve and bury them. Zoom out to that level. In this scripture, she says, I don't hear Luke denying the grief work that keeps getting bumped off of our to-do lists, which are already overwhelming. I hear, she says, how long will this humanity keep asking for extensions? How long will we say, oh, hold up, I'm almost ready, just a little bit longer? The time to act, Jesus is saying, is now. What if we're never ready? We could never be ready for whatever this is. What if there is no, okay, I've prepped enough. I no longer feel anxious or dread. I'm ready to go. What if that doesn't exist? What if we are simply being called to take our good intentions, our professed values and beliefs, and simply begin making the road by walking? The time comes when we must simply jump into the deep end of life, ready or not. I like that wisdom as much as the rest of you do. That's hard stuff. But it leads us to ask, are there any actions toward kingdom building that you have avoided? What can we use this season to commit to? Having made all of this clear, a short while later, Jesus is confronted by a lawyer, a fellow Jew of privilege and wealth, who comes to test Jesus in his knowledge of Jewish law. Tell me, teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life, life in the age to come, which is not a reference to heaven when we die. It's a way of saying, how do I get in on what God is doing here on earth? How do you get in on what God is doing, be part of what God is doing? Well, Jesus answers simply with, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Do this and you will know life. But the lawyer wanted to further justify himself. He wanted to know, I think, where the boundaries between neighbor and stranger are. How far does this call to love others go? How far does my compassion have to extend? Where do I get to say, all right, for you, those of you on this side, love you, take care of you, you deserve basic rights, your needs met, but you people over here, I don't know, you're someone else's problem. You're not something I have to deal with. Where do we get to make that line? In sensing that this is all bound up in the man's heart, Jesus begins by telling a parable. A story that begins and ends with the question, who is my neighbor? Now, in his last speech before being assassinated, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King spoke about this story of the Good Samaritan, because he had visited the Jericho Road in 1959. I've been there too. It's a road from Jerusalem to Jericho. It's about 17 miles long through this desert terrain that drops over 3,000 feet in this sort of steep decline. It was a common commute, but it was also dangerous, because among its many twists and turns on that steep decline were many hiding places where robbers would lie in wait, ready to ambush weary travelers. And so, using that familiar setting, Jesus tells this story. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and took off, leaving him for dead. Now, by chance, he says, a priest just happened to be going down the road. And at this point, we and the lawyer to whom Jesus is speaking are anticipating the priest to be the hero of the story. Right? He's one of our religious leaders. He's an expert in the law. He understands that to love God and love your neighbor is to fulfill the law and the prophets. Surely this is his intention that day as he's walking down the road. But what does he do? Well, worse than nothing. When he sees the man, he averts his eyes, walks over to the other side, and just keeps on going. And so to a Levite, another expert in the law, another good religious person, one of us, an insider who surely believes all the right things about God, how to act, has good intentions for how to live, surely he's a good guy. But he too, when he sees the man in the ditch, he crosses to the other side of the road and he keeps going. It's possible, you might say, to get an A in ethics and to fail the tests of life. Now, at this point, Dr. King said, I'm going to tell you what my imagination tells me about the priest and the Levite. He says, it's possible that those men were afraid. Perhaps, he suggested, they fearfully asked themselves, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? We might think again of that OS 1.0. We all can relate to this way of operating. What will possibly happen to me if I stop to help him? But if these men aren't the hero, this lawyer who is hearing this story from Jesus, he's wondering who is. And just then, Jesus says, a Samaritan, while traveling, came upon the man, and when he saw him, he was moved with compassion. You see, the Good Samaritan, King said, reversed that question. If I do not stop to help this man, he asked, what will happen to him? And then King urged his listeners to imagine themselves on contemporary Jericho roads. Could they, would we ask that same question when we saw others struggling? Would we do it even if, like the Samaritan, the other person was someone we'd been taught to hate or to distrust? Someone we'd been told was the enemy, was not one of us, was not like us. It's a powerful question. But I think actually, rather than being a good Samaritan, the fact that it wasn't a fellow Jew who was the hero, who understood what it meant to be a good neighbor, to love God and neighbor as oneself, but it was actually the stranger, those they'd been taught was a stranger, who is the person who understands what God asks for us, and a Samaritan at that. Well, that meant that this Jew who is hearing the story, we are being asked to identify with the person in the ditch, not as the hero, but as the person in the ditch who'd been beaten, robbed, and left for dead. And to imagine the person who was willing to help you was not your pastor, was not the elected official for whom you voted, by the way. But you might say the person who stopped to help you was an undocumented transgender immigrant from West Africa. That is the shock factor that Jesus' story would have had on this person. Come again, who's the hero? Who understands what God asks of us and who doesn't? To that end, I want to end this morning with one last short story and a question for us in this Lenten season. The Rabbi Sharon Brous shares a story that that pushes us to rethink these categories of who is my neighbor, who is a stranger, and how does this way that we categorize people change the way that we live. My friend, she says, goes to a church of Caribbean immigrants in downtown Los Angeles. And one day, his pastor preached. Say you're walking in downtown LA or Chicago or New York, and a naked man runs in front of you down the sidewalk screaming and cursing. What do? I know you're having an immediate reaction in your mind. What do? Most of us, of course, we briskly cross the street and say to ourselves, well, that guy's unwell. We play out that role of the priest and the Levite. But say you live in a tiny town, maybe 50 households, this pastor goes on. You're walking around one day when a naked man runs in front of you down the sidewalk, screaming and cursing. And because you live in a tiny town, or at least we want to believe people know each other, you do know this man. Is that Henry? And last week, you just happened to know that there was a terrible tragedy. And fire burned Henry's house to the ground, leaving him with nothing. So now what do? Henry, you say, come with me, friend. You need a warm meal and a safe place to stay. What does it take, Rabbi Sharon Brous asks, to shift our collective consciousness from crazy stranger who is unwell, let me cross to the other side of the street and avoid him, to Henry, my neighbor created in God's own image? What does it take for us to cross that threshold, to see the stranger as our neighbor, as God's beloved? I think it takes us going from our good intentions to actual action, to putting our money where our mouths are. It takes not just professing values or beliefs, but a commitment to actually living them out, doing something, getting into community with people who are like and not like us. Because those experiences will challenge and expand and deepen us beyond the simplistic binaries and categories and self-interest that we so often are forced to live within. We have to create opportunities for us to get outside of our comfort zones and get to actually know our neighbors who right now are strangers to us. Doing so will return us to ourselves and to each other and thus to God. Jesus is saying the time to act is now. May it be so for our healing and flourishing, for the healing and flourishing of all the world. Amen.